Ethan Parker's farmhouse stood like a stubborn relic on the edge of Brook Hollow Estates, the last sliver of old farmland in a sea of pastel-colored houses and manicured lawns. Its weathered red barn leaned slightly to the west, the paint peeling in places but still proud. Rows of vegetables lined the yard, and a handful of hens clucked lazily in the morning sun. It was the kind of place that smelled faintly of earth, fresh hay, and honest work, an atmosphere that didn't fit the HOA's vision of picturesque suburbia. For 3 generations, the Parker family had worked this patch of land. Ethan's grandfather had built the barn with his own hands long before the first cul-de-sac appeared. The HOA's neatly printed rulebook didn't apply to him. The property sat just outside their jurisdiction. Still, that didn't stop them from trying. Karen Whitmore, the newly minted HOA president, saw Ethan's farm as a personal insult. Her house, a sprawling beige monument to modern convenience, sat at the end of the street that backed right up to Ethan's fence. From her perfectly trimmed lawn, she had a direct line of sight to his weathered chicken coop and vegetable rows, a sight she described to her friends as an eyesore. Karen was the kind of woman who treated the HOA charter like scripture. Her blonde bob was cut at a precise angle, her smile practiced for social events but thin when she spoke in private. She'd swept into her new role with a mission: maintain property values at all costs and remove anything or anyone that didn't fit her polished vision. Ethan had noticed her watching him from her back patio the week after she took office. At first, it seemed harmless, but then came the letters. They arrived in his mailbox with HOA letterhead, each one signed in bold black ink. President Karen Whitmore. Notice: your property is in violation of community standards. The first letter demanded he repaint his barn a neutral color to blend with the neighborhood aesthetic. The second objected to his unauthorized livestock. The third cited unsanitary conditions due to odors from his compost pile. Ethan read each one carefully, then tossed them into a drawer with a kind of amused irritation. The HOA had no authority over his land, something Karen either didn't understand or refused to accept. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning. Ethan was unloading a crate of fresh cucumbers when Karen strode down his driveway in a white blouse and navy skirt, clipboard in hand. She didn't bother with a greeting. "You can't keep livestock here," she said, her tone clipped. "It's against community guidelines." Ethan straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Ma'am, I'm not in your community." Karen blinked, as if he'd spoken in another language. "Your property affects our property values. That makes it our business." He gave a slow shake of his head. "This land's been here longer than your HOA. You've got no say in what I do here." The color rose in her cheeks. "I'm trying to be reasonable, Mr. Parker. But if you won't comply voluntarily, there will be consequences." Ethan allowed a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Then I guess I'll see what those are." She left without another word, her heels clicking sharply on the driveway. That night, the neighborhood Facebook group lit up. Screenshots later made their way to Ethan's phone. Posts from Karen about how certain residents were dragging down the beauty of Brook Hollow Estates, paired with a blurry zoomed-in photo of his barn. Comments piled up. Some neighbors agreed with her, others stayed quiet, and a few defended Ethan. Tom Harris, Ethan's closest neighbor and one of the defenders, knocked on his door the next day. A man in his 60s with kind eyes and a slow drawl, Tom leaned in the doorway and lowered his voice. "She's not gonna drop this," he said. "Karen's the type who needs to win." Ethan nodded. "Then she's picked the wrong fight." But even as he said it, he knew the battle had begun. The next week brought more letters, this time accompanied by calls to the county code office. Inspectors showed up to check on his chickens and measure the distance from his compost bin to his property line. Each time, they left empty-handed. Everything was within legal limits. Still, the interruptions gnawed at him. Farming was a rhythm, and Karen's constant meddling broke it. Worse, she seemed to enjoy each small disruption. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the barn cast long shadows across the yard, Ethan stood at his fence line, looking toward Karen's pristine backyard. She was there, sipping wine, watching him. She didn't smile. It was then Ethan realized this wasn't about rules. It was personal, and personal wars had a way of getting ugly. The following weeks unfolded like a slow tightening of a noose. Karen's efforts were no longer subtle. They were calculated strikes designed to exhaust Ethan's patience and disrupt his daily life. The first blow landed early on a Saturday. Ethan was setting up a small table near the end of his driveway, arranging cartons of fresh eggs beside baskets of tomatoes, when a black and white police cruiser rolled up. Two officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but curious. "Mr. Parker," one of them said, "we received a complaint that you're running an unauthorized business here." Ethan calmly produced a laminated sheet from his back pocket, a county-issued permit that allowed small-scale farm sales on private property. The officer scanned it, nodded, and handed it back. "Everything checks out," the officer said. "Sorry to bother you." From across the street, Karen stood with folded arms, watching the exchange like a hawk. When the cruiser pulled away, she turned sharply and disappeared into her house without a word. Tom strolled over a few minutes later, hands in his pockets. "She called them, didn't she?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. By Monday, the rhythm of his days was punctuated with unwelcome visits, animal control, code enforcement, even a zoning inspector. Each time, the officials left with nothing to report, but each interruption stole precious hours from his work. Karen's tactics extended online. The neighborhood Facebook group now hosted a steady stream of thinly veiled posts about unsanitary farm conditions and health risks from unregulated egg sales. She never named Ethan directly, but everyone knew who she meant. One evening, Tom stopped by carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He sank into the porch chair beside Ethan and spoke in a low voice. "She's building a case, at least she thinks she is. You ought to be careful. Folks like her don't quit until they've buried you in paperwork." Ethan stared into the darkening yard, the outline of his barn etched against the fading light. "Then maybe it's time I start keeping records of my own." From that night forward, he documented everything. Each letter from the HOA went into a neatly labeled folder. He began recording conversations with Karen on his phone, even the brief ones. Every official visit was logged with dates, times, and names. The next escalation came with a letter far bolder than the others. Printed on thick cream paper and signed in blue ink, it accused Ethan of violating community peace and warned that legal action was imminent unless he ceased all unapproved activities. He read it twice before setting it on the table. The phrasing was deliberate, meant to sound authoritative without actually citing any enforceable rule. Still, it was clear Karen had convinced the HOA board to back her personal vendetta. Ethan contacted an attorney, a measured man named Richard Clark whose calm demeanor hid a razor-sharp legal mind. After reviewing the situation, Richard leaned back in his chair and tapped the letter with one finger. "They can't touch you legally. Your property predates the HOA, and you're fully compliant with county ordinances." But he paused, his gaze steady. "They've crossed into harassment. If this continues, you could have grounds for a lawsuit." The idea of taking legal action didn't thrill Ethan. He'd never been one for courtroom drama. But the thought of Karen continuing unchecked settled in his gut like a stone. Meanwhile, Karen showed no sign of slowing down. A week later, Ethan caught her in the early morning, leaning over his fence with a tape measure, jotting notes on her clipboard. When he stepped outside, she straightened abruptly, offering a brittle smile. "Just verifying some dimensions," she said. "On my property." She didn't answer, just turned and walked away. That evening, Ethan added the incident to his growing file. Each entry was another brick in the wall he was quietly building, one he suspected would eventually corner her. The turning point came when a certified letter arrived from the HOA's legal counsel, formally demanding that Ethan remove his livestock and cease all produce sales. It was laughable in its overreach, but the message was clear. They were ready to drag him into a fight. Ethan closed the envelope and set it on the counter. For the first time since this all began, he felt something other than frustration, a steady, simmering resolve. Karen believed she was tightening the screws, but she didn't see the shift happening. Every accusation, every intrusion, every smug glance from across the fence was now fuel. Ethan wasn't just enduring anymore. He was preparing. And when the time came, he intended to make sure she understood exactly how far she had overstepped. This section ends with Ethan's full mental pivot from defense to quiet preparation, setting up Section 3 for the counterattack phase. Ethan's days took on a new rhythm, not just tending to the farm, but tending to his case. Every sunrise still found him feeding the hens and watering the garden, but his afternoons were now spent piecing together a meticulous record of Karen's campaign against him. The file in his study had grown thick. It held photographs of every notice the HOA had sent, copies of inspection reports showing no violations, and printouts of Karen's posts from the neighborhood Facebook group. He'd highlighted the sentences where she hinted at disease-ridden poultry and illegal produce sales. But the most damning evidence came from his phone. Ethan had installed a discreet camera facing the side of his property where Karen often lingered. The footage showed her slipping through the gate to measure his barn, crouching to peer into his chicken coop, and once, at dawn, snapping photos of his compost bin. Richard, his attorney, reviewed the growing pile with a measured nod. If she keeps this up, we won't just have harassment. We'll have trespassing, defamation, maybe even stalking. Keep going. The stronger the record, the cleaner the case. Meanwhile, Karen's pressure only increased. She called animal control again, claiming a rooster's crow was disturbing the peace. The officer, who came out, found only hens and left shaking his head. She reported that Ethan's market stand was blocking traffic, though his driveway sat a good 30 feet from the road. Each failed complaint seemed to push her further. Her posts online grew sharper, more personal. Neighbors began to take sides. Some, like Tom, checked in regularly to see how Ethan was holding up. Others avoided eye contact altogether. One evening, Ethan returned from delivering a crate of vegetables to the local cafe and found Karen waiting by his mailbox. "You think you're clever," she said, her voice low but tight. "But you're not above the law." "I never said I was," he replied evenly. "You might want to look into what the law actually says before you keep pushing." Her eyes narrowed. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Ethan stepped closer, his tone calm but edged. "No, Karen. You are." She turned sharply and walked away, but the encounter left a new certainty in Ethan's mind. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She wanted him gone entirely. That night, he dug deeper. Public property records revealed something interesting. Karen's own backyard shed lacked a permit. The structure was large enough to require one, and from aerial maps, Ethan could see it sat partially on the HOA-maintained greenbelt, technically public land. He didn't plan to weaponize the information immediately. Timing mattered, but he made copies of every document and photo he found, tucking them neatly into the growing folder. The opportunity to strike came sooner than expected. The HOA called an open meeting to discuss community concerns. Ethan attended quietly, sitting in the back of the small conference room. Karen, presiding at the front, read aloud a list of ongoing issues, her eyes flicking toward him with each point. When she reached the item labeled non-compliant adjacent property, Ethan stood. "I'd like to address that," he said, his voice carrying across the room. Karen's smile was thin. "Mr. Parker, this is an HOA matter, which has no jurisdiction over my property," he interrupted. "And yet, for months, I've endured baseless inspections, false reports, and defamatory statements from this board's president." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's posture stiffened. "I have documented every incident," Ethan continued, pulling a thick envelope from his bag. "This includes recorded conversations, photographs of trespassing, and copies of online posts. I will be filing a harassment and defamation suit this week." He set the envelope on the table in front of her. "For the record." The room fell silent. Even the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Karen's face flushed, but she said nothing. Ethan left the meeting without another word, feeling the weight in his chest lift slightly. Outside, Tom caught up to him. "You just dropped a bomb in there," Tom said with a grin. "It was time," Ethan replied. As he drove home, Ethan knew the confrontation wasn't over. Karen was the kind of person who would fight until she had nothing left. But for the first time, the momentum had shifted. She was on the defensive now, and he intended to keep her there. This section ends with a public confrontation and the formal beginning of Ethan's legal counterattack, perfectly priming Section 4 for the courtroom resolution and Karen's downfall. The weeks leading to the court date felt like the final stretch before harvest. Long days of preparation, careful pruning, and quiet anticipation. Ethan met regularly with Richard, fine-tuning the evidence until it formed an airtight wall. Every letter, every inspection report, every grainy clip of Karen creeping onto his property was organized and indexed. Karen, for her part, stayed largely out of sight. The Facebook group posts stopped, replaced by vague updates from the HOA board about legal matters. But Ethan knew she was still working behind the scenes. Neighbors whispered about her calling emergency board meetings and trying to rally support for the HOA's case. When the day arrived, the small county courtroom was fuller than usual. Curious residents had taken seats in the back, some leaning forward eagerly, others shifting uncomfortably. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture rigid, a stack of papers neatly aligned in front of her. Her lawyer, a brisk woman in a navy suit, whispered in her ear. Ethan sat beside Richard, calm but alert. He dressed simply, clean jeans, a pressed shirt, boots polished just enough to pass muster. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. The HOA's attorney opened with a long-winded speech about community harmony and visual cohesion, painting Ethan's property as a disruptive element in an otherwise pristine neighborhood. She listed complaints about noise, smell, and unauthorized sales, her tone heavy with disapproval. When it was Richard's turn, his approach was surgical. He acknowledged the HOA's concerns, then dismantled them one by one. "Your Honor," Richard said, placing a folder on the bench, "the Parker property is not under HOA jurisdiction. Every cited activity complies fully with county law, and the repeated, unfounded complaints filed by the plaintiff's client constitute harassment under state statute." He presented the evidence in measured doses, inspection reports showing no violations, printouts of Karen's posts implying Ethan's products were unsafe, timestamps proving her trespass. The camera footage drew audible murmurs from the back rows. And finally, Richard added, sliding a separate envelope across the table, records from the county property office showing that Ms. Whitmore's own backyard shed is unpermitted and encroaches on HOA-maintained land. Karen's face tightened, but she said nothing. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, looking over his glasses, "it appears your actions toward Mr. Parker were not only outside your authority, but also in clear violation of harassment statutes. This court dismisses the HOA's complaint in full. Furthermore, I am ordering you, personally, to pay damages to Mr. Parker for undue distress and legal fees." The gavel struck, final and sharp. Karen sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the table. Around them, the quiet in the courtroom broke into a low buzz. A few neighbors exchanged knowing looks. Tom caught Ethan's eye and gave a small, satisfied nod. Outside, the air felt lighter. Reporters from the local paper approached, eager to cover the farmer versus HOA showdown. Ethan kept his comments brief, letting the story speak for itself. Within days, the ripple effects began. HOA members, embarrassed by the spectacle and the loss, called for a special election. Karen was voted out as president by a landslide. Her once loyal allies distanced themselves, leaving her isolated. The county, tipped off by Ethan's public filing, inspected her property. The unpermitted shed had to be dismantled, and she was fined for encroaching on public land. Landscaping crews tore out the ornate hedges she'd planted beyond her property line, leaving a bare stretch of dirt along her fence. Ethan didn't gloat, at least not outwardly. But he did take a certain satisfaction in repainting his barn that summer, choosing the brightest, most unapologetic shade of red he could find. From Karen's back window, it was impossible to miss. Neighbors began stopping by more often, buying eggs and vegetables, lingering to chat. The tension that had hung over the edge of Brook Hollow Estates slowly eased, replaced by a cautious camaraderie. Even those who'd once sided with Karen admitted, in quieter moments, that they'd grown tired of her rule. One Saturday morning, as Ethan was stacking fresh cartons of eggs on his table, Tom walked up with a grin. "Heard Karen's putting her house on the market." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "No buyers yet?" "Not with that reputation," Tom chuckled. They shared a quiet laugh. A few hens wandered close, clucking softly, the sun catching the bright red boards of the barn. Ethan felt a calm he hadn't known in months, a steady, rooted peace. Karen's house would eventually sell, though not for the price she'd hoped. But by then, she was gone from Brook Hollow Estates, her reign reduced to a cautionary tale told over coffee and garden fences. And Ethan, the stubborn farmer she couldn't control, carried on as he always had, planting, harvesting, and selling his goods to neighbors who now saw his barn not as an eyesore, but as a landmark. The war was over, and in the end, the land had outlasted the paper rules. This section ties off the central conflict with a clean resolution, delivers the sweet karma promised by the title, and ends on a note of quiet, lasting victory.